Hello everybody, welcome to another Detailed Diatribe, where today I am Blue and I'm joined by Red, and we're not talking about media today. This one's going to get a little bit meta. We're doing a little bit of a discussion of how we, or really specifically me, do my job as a historian on the internet.
So we are talking about media from a certain point of view. It's just all the media that we make.
Don't want to lift myself up to lofty heights of Arcane, Castlevania, Batman, and all that stuff. But it's a kind of media, the social media, the worst kind.
Social media derogatory. And I am here as your humble audience surrogate because I know that this happened as a library talk, but I wasn't there, so I haven't seen this slideshow yet. So I'll be here to go do all the appropriate ooh and ah, and tell me more, Mr. Blue. How do you do this thing?
Mister, yeah.
Oi, mister.
I originally gave this talk at a library in Baltimore when I was there for VidCon in 2022, and it was a really fun time, and I was like, I'm gonna give this talk at a whole bunch of places, and then in the years after, I completely didn't because I was focusing on work instead.
Yep.
And when I traveled places, I was like, we're gonna go to New York for Comic-Con. I'm too busy, never mind.
New York will do that to you.
But we're here, and I wanted to find an opportunity to put this on the channel, so we're going to talk about the art of historical storytelling online, also known as better historians exist, so what am I even doing? These are the questions. What am I doing? So I am essentially here to casually justify my entire existence to you, and those of you who are here, probably prior viewers of OSP, so you know what our deal is. We try to make videos on cool and unique topics in world culture. But, the question is how? Every video, we're starting from at least kind of, not quite scratch, but not complete knowledge. So we have to start from, this is a topic I know I want to cover, to, I can in fact speak on this with authority to turn this into a script and have it be a video and be cool and awesome and get showered in praise and likes by the algorithm gods or
Big
whatever.
Number,
so
go
there's
bigger.
a process. Yeah. And it all starts with the research. It's always the very first thing we do is getting familiar with the topic and getting all of our ducks in a row so that we can turn that into a script later. So for an example, I'm going to pull from a couple of examples from my back catalog here. How might I get familiar with a structure like the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev? There's a lot of information about it, but it's dispersed in different places. And if I'm just jumping into this, I know this is a cool building, I find it pretty, I want to talk about it, but I don't necessarily know what I want to talk about or how until I see the shape of the narrative. So it's a lot of the very beginning process of research is getting a sense of the story at a glance, and then going in more specifically to dig into getting the actual details. But I need to essentially first start by taking the lay of the land and getting a sense of the topic before I dig in. And obviously things can hit me with a left hook and completely change what the video ends up being, but it always has to start with a concept.
Oh, yeah.
Red, is that roughly how it works for the myth videos as well?
Well, it's a little bit different because the thing is, history is infinitely deep and mythology is not. It's got a lot going on, but it's kind of differently fractal. With history, you can kind of just keep downscaling, but with mythology, at some point, you're going to be limited. I mean, with history, you're also limited by the sources, but with mythology, you're limited by, a much smaller number of people writing down their perspective on this thing. In a lot of cases, especially once I sort of ran through all the classic big-name Greek myths, the problem is finding out that the myths exist in the first place. Before I sort of phased out doing super regular small myth videos, I was sort of resorting to reading through the old Andrew Lang fairy books where he just basically pulled 500 folk tales with very dubious sourcing a lot of the time and just put them in a book and then made 15 of those things. Because, you can't research a myth without knowing it exists, and a lot of them branch off in interesting directions, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them are fairly self-contained. So with history, you do sort of have the benefit, especially when you're starting to do more architectural history videos, that after a certain point, you can just kind of go that building looks cool. Wonder what's up with that. Googles it. Oh, cool. All of the architecture, all the building records. Nice. Okay, everyone it changed hands through, why that specific modification is there. Whereas things are a little bit differently shaped over in the mythology side of things. But it does sort of reach a similar point of well, now I have to just go through and read everything I can find about this thing and take my notes and then go from there and the actual pulling a narrative out of it and making it funny. So the research part of it can look fairly similar, although it's a little bit, I guess, with history it's more deep and with myths it's more broad, depending on how much context you want to pull into a specific story. It's like, well, there's a version of it that's over here. Ah, there we go. Whoops, did I accidentally preempt your next slide again?
No, you knew exactly where this happens once per detailed diatribe. It has to be like this.
It
is essentially like an excavation. You are digging down, but also digging wide, and those are two axes you have to keep in mind as you're working on a research project like this. So if I dig straight down, I'm going to be completely lost. So I do have to do a little bit of that more like mythological, like lateral kind of excavation to familiarize myself with the topic. So if I'm talking about Saint Sophia in Kiev, I have to get familiar with the Kievan Rus. Then I can get familiar with Prince Volodymyr, who built the thing. Then I can get into the actual church itself, and I can kind of like build the ramp, starting from what's the most basic part of this? Okay, Kievan Rus, great. Concept of Ukraine. Let's work our way down into the actual trench of the specific topic. So every time we're doing a video, at least in the history sides specifically, it's this kind of like starting wide, and then you get enough information that you can actually start to dig straight down into just this one specific thing.
Well, you got to know where to dig first.
Yeah. You have to find out where the dinosaur bones are hidden, and it's like, okay, cool, this one, let's yank it up out of the ground and get going. So in this case, what did I do? What did that research look like? This is a very funny example because
I remember this actually.
Most of the time, a lot of our sources are conveniently and comfortably in English, but in the case of Ukrainian history, English language sources are fairly new, post-1991, fall of the Soviet Union, independent Ukraine, and there were sources previously about various topics in Ukrainian history and Ukrainian architecture, but they were in Ukrainian and then usually heavily filtered through communist propaganda that religion is stupid and it shouldn't exist. So a lot of the sources for Saint Sophia were very heavily biased and hard to get hands on. So a lot of the scholarship is fairly recent and not in English. So my research process wasn't giving me much to work with, but I had one angle that I wanted to follow, which was in English, it's called Saint Sophia Cathedral, but I had a sense that maybe this was a mistranslation, because I kept seeing that it was named in reference to Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Hagia Sophia does not mean Saint Sophia in Greek, it means holy wisdom. So I wanted to try to do some linguistic looking to see if Sofijski Sovo or Svatoi Sophie in Ukrainian was Saint Sophia, a specific saint, or holy wisdom specifically. And in doing that, I found the Ukrainian language Wikipedia page, which was able to answer that question for me, and also was about 75 times as long as the English one. The English Wikipedia page was pretty short and kind of useless. Most of them are. But the Ukrainian one was about 25 pages long in PDF form and had a lot more pictures, which was really interesting, with very specific descriptions of each part of the church. Whereas the English one is, it was built, the end. Like, this is useless. This sucks. So I had this document, and obviously it wasn't the be-all, end-all, but it's like, ooh, this is a bunch of stuff in one place. I can start here. So I had to translate it. And I was able to do that by, with Cyan's help, downloading the Wikipedia page as a PDF and then chucking it into a Google Translate program that lets you translate entire PDFs at once. And of course, it's still a computer, so there was an interesting complication where I was reading about how Hetman Ivan Mazepa in the 1700s put a bathhouse on top of the tower, and I'm like, what the f*** are you talking about? I don't think those are functions of a church. And then I did a little bit of digging, and it turns out that in Ukrainian, bath is also idiomatically a word for dome.
Amazing.
And that makes a lot more sense. So the translation I was reading is like, yep, and then he built a bath in this tower, and he put a bath on that tower, and a bath over the central apse, and it's like, cool. Makes no sense on paper, but if I do a little digging, I can figure out what they're actually going for. So that was a very fun research challenge to do, and that was the biggest example of them. But there were a handful of smaller things kind of like that. And then, starting with this big 25-page document, I could take some notes, and I can do the little trick of going to the bottom of Wikipedia to find its sources. And I was able to find some other Ukrainian language, like academic publications from like the late 90s and early 2000s. And translate those. They were also in Ukrainian, but I had the plan, I had the framework, and I could work through that and then get a lot of information really quickly, which was able to get me everything I needed to start writing the script. So it was weird as hell, but that's what was so fun.
Yeah. The thing about starting from Wikipedia is, I mean, I'll also absolutely stand by that. Phase one of any research project, as far as I'm concerned, is getting a feel for the lay of the land. And if you use Wikipedia as basically roadmap, it's a very useful way to get the top-down perspective on what you're going to be looking at in the future, and then you have to go digging and make sure everything that you saw on the map is actually really there. And like starting from 25-page Ukrainian language Wikipedia page was a hard place to start, but it is very funny that that's often how that works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It got me what I needed. It got me exactly what I needed.
It, as a person who has, for large portions of her career, done summaries for a living, it is very funny to me that I'll always be like, yeah, summary is step one, then you have to go check. Like, don't stop at the summary, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, exactly. But it was a fun part of the process. It's rare that I have to do something quite that extreme, but it's a really great example. So unique challenge, unique solutions, modern problems require modern solutions. In this process, though, ended up learning a ton of stuff about other architecture in Kyiv that fully didn't make it into the video. So I had a bunch of off-cut notes that's like, okay, that stuff doesn't really fit. I kind of found my narrative and these other things didn't really fit in it. But also, this is a very specific angle. I found the thing I was after and I dug straight down, which means that if you ask me what I know about Rus politics or their military history or a bunch of other, like, day-to-day cultural stuff, I have absolutely no knowledge of those things because that's not what I was digging for. I got a basic understanding through my kind of like first and second layer excavations of the Kievan Rus and, early Kiev and Prince Volodymyr, but anything other than that wasn't the architecture, gone. Nothing. Zilch. So even though I seem like an expert in this one thing, it is a result of the way I did my research. I don't magically know everything after doing this. I'm very dialed into the specific thing that I'm after for this video.
I will say, in my observation, experts are the people who are the most likely to say that they are not experts because they are very aware of the huge bulk of things that they don't know, whereas people who don't know jack and therefore don't know what they don't know will proudly proclaim that they know absolutely everything there is to know about a given topic. Anyway.
Having watched a single Instagram reel about the Egyptian pyramids, I'm awaiting my PhD in the mail.
Oh, boy.
And this does kind of point to the idea of like, okay, at what point do we turn and like start digging straight down after doing these initial excavations? So I like to think that the research process has essentially two phases. First is keep going until you figure out what the core narrative is. In my case, the excavation process of figuring out what I wanted to know about Saint Sophia, getting the context to be able to dig into that properly. And the second phase is digging into that properly. Keep going until I no longer have any questions. So that's the barometer that I will always use. If something is kind of going twang in my head and I'm unsure about it, just keep researching, just keep going. And then eventually I will stop having questions, and then I will think I'm done, and I'll start writing the script, and then I'll get another question, and I'll go back and research something really quickly, and then I'll think I'm done, and then it goes back and forth until I finish the script. And so the third phase is actually go back a couple more times because there's more things that you didn't realize you needed to know. But that's part of the fun. That's part of the process.
Yeah, definitely.
This is a fundamentally unpredictable aspect of it, is I can't know that I'm really done until I'm finished with the script. Raw research investment, it's important to note, does not automatically correlate to more interesting video scripts, because there have been times where I set out very boldly, bright-eyed to get some information, research topic. In the case of my Viking Age video from a few years back, I dug for days reading into various sources before I decided actually none of this is helpful for me. I was reading about like Viking burials in like East Ireland and Northern Britain, and how that interacted with like Viking culture and stuff, and it was cool, but it was not useful for constructing a greater narrative. So I had to basically scrap a week worth of notes and start over and be like, okay, let's try this again. I'm gonna start digging over here now instead for my excavations. And then it ended up working. I'm really happy with how that video turned out, but it was a very tricky process to get all that information lined up. On the other hand, sometimes I'm lucky enough to dig for an hour and strike gold, such as when I was doing my video on the Doge's Palace in Venice, and I was Googling for about 30 minutes or 45 minutes, and I found a website of the Doge's Palace by the Museum of the Doge's Palace in Venice. The site telling me about itself, which was extremely useful. And this is actually kind of another case with the language thing cropped up, because I saw the English language section of the website had some details, not a ton. When I clicked the little Italian flag and switched the language, there was suddenly a lot more stuff to work with. So I'm like, I can translate this, that's okay. So once again, I find myself being able to, using language to get way more detail than what the English version of the internet has. We're so used to thinking that the internet has everything, but in fact, it tends to have very little.
One of the fascinating things about the research process is bumping up against the edges of things that aren't online. It's like, oh, this is a research paper. Can I find like a crunchy PDF that some university was like passing out to its students? Because that's usually the best I'm gonna get.
Yeah.
JSTOR is good. If it's not on JSTOR, oh, may the Lord help you.
Later on, I went to the Doge's Palace with Cyan in Venice the
Super
year after,
cash.
and I got a book from them that is way more than even what they had on the website. So next time I need to look something up, I've got a much better source than even what I was able to find.
Yay.
So it was a fun case that I could get basically what I needed for that video by finding it right from the horse's mouth. But it is rare that that kind of thing happens. So within the video schedule, I can't assemble perfect information. We're on a kind of 2 weeks and change timeline. Got to pick my battles. Sometimes I'll get a little bit into something and think, you know what, this isn't actually working, and I just kind of throw it on the shelf and maybe come back to it later. But I understand this can be why the deep dives are a little challenging to research, particularly because you get to the edge of a god's mythological attestation, and then it's like, well, there's nothing else on Hestia.
Oh,
Goodbye.
It's sometimes I'll start a deep dive research process and be like, I know where this is going. I have a feeling, and then I'm completely wrong. And it is kind of frustrating, specifically when you get like the thing with Loki turns into a seal and fights Heimdall, who's also a seal. It's like, what? Tell me more. And they're like, I can't. There's nothing. It's all gone. Yeah. And like Hestia is a good example. I haven't looked as far as I can, but the problem is it's hard to tell if I've looked as far as I can because there's... Where is she? Am I simply looking in the wrong place? Or is there something that I can actually do? And like anytime I do one of the mythological deep dives, and this is part of why I haven't done as many, in large part because, frankly speaking, after a while, they sort of structure themselves very similarly. It's like, we've gotten back to the hypothetical Proto-Indo-European pantheon that half the people in the comment section will be like, perfect, and the other half will be like, I can't believe you cited this as an academic concept. It's a lot. One of the things I was considering researching is Zeus, but he's really annoying. I mean, yes, but also like research-wise. He's really annoying because if you go looking like in the name etymology, he's basically just an offshoot of like Dios, God with a capital G, like a big sky daddy with beard type. And like, so it's like, great, any more information? Not really. Here's Jupiter, here's Jove. They're also etymologically rooted from that, but then also they all got syncretized back together. So like, what are we doing here? Is that interesting? Because after a while, the outcome is still Zeus, like, like, is it really worth unpacking that? Whereas like with Hermes, I was just like, I don't think I'm going to find anything interesting. And it was like, not only is this profoundly interesting, it just kind of keeps going. You really never know before you start delving into something where it's going to take you. And even if you have like a basic understanding of what you think the rough outline of the story is going to look like, you will be shocked at how wrong you can have been. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the research process is how much it really just kind of makes you very accustomed to the idea that you're not right, and you kind of just have to be ready to correct with new information and then move on. Because if you're still hung up about having been wrong about something, you can't still feel it to that same degree of intensity, 10 years in. It's amazing how much things that just like feel correct or sound correct will just make sense in your brain. And then you're going looking and you're like, neither of those things were correct. And the thing that is correct doesn't feel or sound correct. But it is, because the world isn't always simple. And that, anyway.
Ain't that the way?
Yeah.
For a couple more good examples and bad examples, best case scenario, essentially, is if I can get a book, read a book, and then have 7 to 10 pages of wonderful notes that I can then condense down into a 3-page script. It is great when I can just start this and read through it, and then it's like amazing. I have my whole like wide view of everything, and if there are a couple extra little things I need to get some sources or corroborate on or check, like, oh, this book doesn't really talk about this. Let me see what I can pull into here. Great. Fantastic. We love how that works. That's how I got my English is a Mess video. That's how I got the Pope fights on Caterina Sforza. I was actually waiting for my Caterina Sforza book to get available at the local library, and I was looking online, and I'm like, oh, this is awful. There's nothing available. This is impressively terrible. There is truly nothing here that is useful. And I got the book, and I just read it over the course of like 2-3 days, and I'm like, oh my god, finally sources. Someone actually explaining it. And even then, books are fallible, because as I was reading the Tigris of Forli here, I was like, well, I don't necessarily agree with the author's interpretation of Machiavelli and Caterina's relationship. I think there's a lot more going on than simply he didn't like her very much. And also with Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue by John McWhorter, that is a case where the scholarship has kind of moved on in a couple places from that. There are some things that I presented of like, yes, well, me not being a linguist is like, you can actually see there's this type of construction only exists in West Celtic, like Welsh and stuff, and people nowadays are like, actually, there might be an antecedent of this in like Proto-West Germanic or whatever. So books are not completely infallible, but for getting information for a YouTube video, they are really, really good when I can get them. So I have, a handful of really useful books on my shelf that I will reach for first if I'm going into a topic. I've got my 3 or 4 Greece books that I love. I've got my 3 or 4 Rome books that I love, and it's great to be able to have those because as much as we love the internet, it is only so useful.
Yeah. After a certain point, the sheer saturation of stuff on the internet can start making it more detrimental than helpful, which is a real bummer.
Yeah. And this is perhaps best illustrated by these 2 videos, the worst case scenario, where there is no readily available book on the topic, at least not one that's less than 100 years old. In the case of Pope fights, there are some books, but they're from the 1900s and the 30s, which is not helpful or good.
Dangerous.
And the online sources are unreliable, hard to assess the quality of. If you stumble onto someone's little WordPress blog, it can either be the worst garbage imaginable or an actual gem, and you have to suss it out each time, and that can be very taxing and time consuming and labor intensive. So the worst part on top of that, the internet is actually quite fragile in some cases. So when I was doing my research on Thomas Cole, whom I was not able to find a great single historical book for, I was able to find, similar to the Doge's Palace, the Thomas Cole National Historic Site telling me about Thomas Cole, which is amazing. They had this whole interactive website where you could go through all the paintings and see early sketches and some historical context and Thomas Cole's quotes about his own process, and that was incredible. And then someone asked me to pull up that site again in the the Discord discussion after the video went up, and I went to go find it in my sources, and the link was broken because in the week between when I researched the video and the week that I posted it, only 1 week, they just nuked the page. It's available on the Internet Archive last I checked, but the website is gone, and I simply would not have found that if I did my video as much as a week later, which is insane to think about. So much useful information. Maybe they're going to build a new version of it, maybe, but if that wasn't there, the video would have been substantially worse because I wouldn't have had access to a lot of great information that I don't know where I would have found anywhere else. So the internet is very fragile, which sucks.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but it's fragile, it's unreliable, and it's getting harder to search as parts of it are actively enshittened in key ways.
Yes.
I've been seeing there's apparently a dedicated league of Wikipedia editors who are just fighting for their damn lives, keeping all the AI-generated art and LLM paragraphs of garbage off of the site. You're holding back the tide, but man, it's so frustrating. The internet, its greatest strength and its greatest weakness are all the same thing. It is extremely accessible, it is extremely flexible, but that also means it's extremely, fluid and unreliable, and it can very easily be polluted by any sufficient quantity of garbage. So, finding the gems is the hard part.
And our job is to make those gems and to make the internet a better place than we found it. So, with the research done, what comes next? We don't just spit it back at you, we have to turn it into a story. And that applies for mythology, literature, and history alike. I think that one applies across the board.
With mythology and literature, usually the story is already there. It's about boiling it down into a shorter, funnier story.
But also there's context and presentation and interpretation in places.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's analysis. What I'm saying is that I think there is actually an interesting distinction to make here, because history isn't a story. History is events happening simultaneously all across the world in billions of people's lives. Turning that into a story makes it much easier for us to conceive of it and see large-scale patterns, but the story isn't automatically present in the scenario that played out. So when you are recounting a history, and this is very important to be aware of because it helps you recognize that any given situation can be turned into potentially an indefinite number of stories. You can reframe the same thing in so many different ways just by choosing which elements to highlight. And everybody knows this on some level. There's that joke about if you change the score of a film in a certain scene, it makes it feel completely different. The same events are happening, but the story that's being told is different. Same thing happens when people pull out historical narratives. There's a reason why history is so fractal. You can take any given chunk of it and not just pull out one narrative, but pull out a whole bunch of narratives. At the time of recording, the Katerina Sforza video just went up, and one of the things that I thought was so interesting about her is not like the specific slice of the world that she lived in, it's that she ended up being a very interesting POV character to follow because she engaged with so many interesting things happening in such an interesting way. That wasn't what set her apart from the people that were also contemporaries to her. It just makes the story that you get just by hitching your wagon to her much more interesting than some of the others. So when it comes to crafting a historical narrative, it really is a degree of story crafting in it, choosing what to highlight, choosing where to end your narrative so that it ends on potentially an uplifting note.
Yeah, that's a really hard part, is where does the story end?
Because that's the thing, in real history, the story never ends. A person's life might end, but the consequences of their actions don't end when they die. So where do you end the story? And a lot of times it's like, well, if I end the story here, it ends on a triumphant, uplifting note. But if I end the story here, it ends on a down, sad note. So what's the tone I, as the creator, as the story weaver, want to make happen? Whereas, comparatively speaking, when it comes to myths and literature and even the trope analysis, it's much easier. Like the trope analysis is barely telling a story. It's more unpacking the ways that different stories have done things that I think are interesting. Sort of taking an analytical, and here we've got a real beauty out in the wild, doing it in this interesting subversion. Whereas with myths and stories, the story they want to tell is already there. And whether I retell it as faithfully as I can, or, putting a little stank on it to make it funnier, or taking some digs at the writer because they deserve it, Lovecraft. It's that's my call, but the base story that I'm trying to recount is still the same shape. Whereas, as a historical researcher, your job is very different, and I think has some very interesting layers to it. Yeah.
That is fair. I'm just imagining, the nature documentary, and here we see Catra having the worst day of her f***ing life.
So far.
Tune back in tomorrow, where it will inevitably become far worse.
And the most interesting part about this specimen is that somehow it's kind of all her fault.
Yes. But no, I think you're making a very good point that there are differences to what the structure of each genre of storytelling requires. But insofar as we're talking about history here, the narrative will tend to bubble up from the research process based on what we're finding during that excavation, what we find most interesting about a topic. In my case, the architecture, if we're talking about the Kiev example, will guide what I want to talk about rather than the politics or the military history or, a million other possible things. So, Red, as you were putting it very well just a moment ago, storytelling is very much an art that I think is a different kind of track from the more technical skill of research.
For sure.
And then it is also a layers game, so it's a matter of pacing and flow, and there are layers to the story that require unpacking, and shifting between those layers is a very complicated pacing consideration that I have to wrestle with all the time when I'm writing my script. So, for an example, the Saint Sophia, what if I jump in right to the cathedral? Just as if I do that with my research, the viewer will be completely lost. So like what I was doing, getting acquainted with the topic, so too for the viewer. So I have to start broad, start with the concept of Ukraine and the Kievan Rus, and then I can go down a layer to Prince Volodymyr and what he was doing, and then go down a layer to Saint Sophia, and then I can stick kind of in that zone, more in depth, zoom in, and slow the pacing down as I get to what is more the core of the video. And if I'm treating the speed of Saint Sophia at the same speed I'm treating, hundreds of years of the Kievan Rus, it's going to be a mess. So pacing requires speeding up and slowing down, and this is kind of like an obvious storytelling thing, but it is important to consider how that affects a telling of history. And as I go into, okay, we're in Saint Sophia mode now, we're here, I can stick with now kind of this new POV character where it gets built, and then we kind of go back up a layer to, okay, what's the immediate history after it is completed? Okay, 1241, Mongols sack it, oh no, church is abandoned, yada, yada, yada. Okay, we can zoom back out to Ukrainian history, to, next major time point, 1600s, when the Cossack Hetmanate gets created, and then we can zoom back down. Okay, cool, there's more stuff happening on the church now. So we're kind of bouncing around in time and space, which is a complicated thing to do well, and if it seems like it flows nicely, that is because I put a lot of effort into that in my videos. And then we get to the idea of characters and how we separate history in my videos from the dull list of endless facts happening read, like what you said, is history is just kind of a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And there's no point, there's no themes, there's no plot progression, there's no arc until that gets created by the teller. So we try to turn this into a story by having characters exist. So obviously, Prince Volodymyr is a character. He's a real human person who did stuff, and we can learn from that. St. Sophia, as a cathedral, takes on a character and a role based on what people have put into it over the centuries and what they got out of it and what meaning they found in that. So the church becomes a character. And then we can zoom from the microcosm to the macrocosm. Ukraine itself takes on a kind of character that we can interpret from these events and these people and these structures playing out over time. And by their powers combined, the story becomes about identity for a whole culture, not just architecture. So you think it's architecture, then blammo, it's a tale of cultural pride and resistance to outside forces trying to tear it down. And that is the art. That's the whole job, is making that fit and being able to weave that together. So you have all the pieces to then at the end, at the conclusion, be like, oh yeah, wait a minute, this is a story about identity. Cool, I get it now. So that's part of what's fun about being able to do that. It's a very Thucydidean idea that states have characters to them. Sparta will always act in such a way. Athens will always act in such a way. The Athenians love to steal and grab for more stuff. The Spartans like to kick people. This is just how they are as characters. The whole state takes on an idea, and so too here for Ukraine. So that is a kind of ancient style of storytelling that I ascribe to, because I think it works very well. We do that maybe subconsciously in modern tellings of like, oh, like America did this and Britain did that, and we talk about the state kind of like as an agent, even though it is an ecosystem composed of hundreds and millions of people at any given time.
Pardon me while I inflict psychic damage on a percentage of our viewership. Hitalia. Anyway, moving on.
Oh my god. No!
Yay! I do think that it's a very interesting thing to have happen when sort of a theme emerges from the story you're drawing out of history. And in this specific case, turning it into a narrative of identity, I think, works very well. But it is also, it's an interesting thing to be aware of, that there's a lot of intentionality when it comes to the framing of historical narratives.
Yeah.
Everyone who writes any sort of historical narrative is going to be choosing specific things to include and specific things to discard as irrelevant. And if they're not doing it intentionally, they're doing it subconsciously, because you cannot tell a story about history that includes every single pertinent detail simply because there's not enough time in the day. There's too many people with too much going on. So any given narrative of history has a thesis and a story that it's trying to tell using the medium of historical events. It's an important thing to be aware of, because we're sort of, I guess, wired to take in stories and kind of, internalize them much more naturally than most anything else. Like, again, getting explained something complicated is hard. Getting told a story with a simple breakdown is easy.
Yeah.
But, you have to be aware that, like, all stories are crafted with intent, and they are all leaving out the context that is just present in any given set of things that are happening in real life. Just because a story can be told about a situation doesn't mean that it is automatically the truth. Historical truth, I think, is one of those things that people are constantly trying to find a way back to, because it's like, how much of this can I include while telling a story that can be understood and not leaving anything of significance out, while still capturing, what I consider to be the core truth of this narrative. And is that in any way true in a way that matters? Because I'm still leaving things out. I don't envy you, man. Telling stories that are just made up is much simpler.
Yeah, I do think, though, you were onto something of, like, kind of getting towards the idea of truth. I think there is a really good comparison to, like, we don't actually know the laws of physics. We're just really good at describing them pretty well with the understandings and equations that we have. So we keep, like, narrowing in closer and closer and closer to how the universe actually works. But we can't actually write it out in prose. We have to kind of, like, create models and an upper bound and a lower bound of where the way the universe works fits into. History is kind of similar, where complete objective truth is not necessarily possible, because even if you are only printing dry, rote facts without any sense of, like, spin or impression or idea or theme, which facts you choose to print or not print have a bias.
Yep.
So all storytelling then, working one step off of that, is that whatever stories you do or don't tell is bias. How you construct a narrative is bias. What that narrative says and means is bias. It is bias all the way down.
Yeah.
That's what storytelling is. We can do our best to not lie, and that's where we get back to the physics idea of like, well, okay, we can't perfectly describe how gravity actually works. We can approximate it as like, 9.8 meters per second or whatever.
Squared,
right. Thank you. Even if we're approximating, historical truth as best we can through storytelling, we're making a conscious effort not to lie about it. And that's, I think, something that we can easily lose sight of, is that not having bias and not lying are two different things. Not having bias is impossible.
Yep.
Not lying is actually remarkably straightforward. It's pretty simple to just choose to not be an asshole, and you can do a lot better of a job. Again, not perfect, not complete objective historical truth, but a lot fucking better than if you set out to just do bullshit or push an agenda that you come up with first and then twist the facts to suit afterwards.
Yeah.
So you can very easily throw bias into a historical narrative, and sometimes they don't look all that different. But if you actually dig in and if you know what you're looking for, if you know the history, you can kind of suss out pretty quickly, like, oh yeah, no, this person is making an interesting point, or oh, this person is lying through their teeth to push an idea.
I do think that specific difference between coming in with a conclusion and then looking for evidence that supports it versus just trying to get as much information as you can and then pulling a conclusion out of the information you have, those are two fundamentally different approaches to research, and part of what makes our job so difficult is that we always try and do the find out everything you can and then pull the story out of it afterwards approach, because that's how you get better, more interesting, more surprising situations, and also how you don't propagandize using weird conclusions that you've already come to when you start. Anyway, it's complicated. It just kind of keeps getting more complicated the more you think about it.
It does. So for an example, speaking of bias, we're going to talk about how the Romans lied about everything.
Yay!
One video that I had a lot of fun making was History Summarized, The Birth of Rome, where the essential premise was very early on in my Roman Republic video, I basically said, according to Roman legend, Aeneas, Alban kings, Romulus and Remus, Wolf, stabbed some guys. Okay, great, we have a republic. Cool, let's move on. Because it is fundamentally unverifiable, I wasn't going to bother devoting that much time to it, and it was a question of layers. I wanted to get through that stuff more quickly because we didn't really know, so I felt like it wasn't a great strategy out the gate to slow down all that much and spend a lot of time on it when I can get to the history that we have much better documented. But if I was to go back and tell the story properly, what would I do? What could I do if I was to tackle this story specifically and self-contained within its own little thing? So in order to unpack this story where the Romans were heavily biased in their telling, I tackled it in layers. So the new strategy was essentially, first, tell the story as the Romans knew it, like I just said, and then second was to vivisect why it does not hold up to any scrutiny whatsoever. It's not just the mythological elements like Aeneas and Troy and the whole story with that, and Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf mom and having Mars as their dad. There's also a lot of narrative inconsistencies, like, for instance, how the 7 kings of Rome between Romulus and Tarquinius Superbus ruled for a combined 244 years with an average regnal length of 35 years-ish each, and compared to the rest of the history of Roman emperors, even into the Byzantine period, a full 2,500 years later, I think like 2 or 3 emperors in that whole span of time reigned for more than like 35, like maybe like one guy is above 40. I think like Basil II or something is way the hell up there with like 45 or 46. That, to me, the mythological stuff, the amount of time they're expecting us to think these kings ruled for is the biggest historical inconsistency that I find my intelligence most insulted by being presented as true.
Yeah, it's always weird when you get blindsided by stuff like that. It's also how like in a lot of old stories, they'll be like, and by the way, people lived way longer back then. And I almost feel like that was just trying to spackle over, like, look, mathematically, it doesn't make sense. But, whatever. Yeah,
because they had this, this story of, okay, Bronze Age, Trojan War, ballpark that roughly like 1100 BC. And then we have Romulus and Remus, 750s, because we wanted to align, the Romans wanted to align our internal calendar with the first Olympics in Greece that were like 770 something, I want to say.
Right.
And thus positioning ourselves like, we started being cool and civilized at the same time that this much bigger and cooler civilization started being cool and civilized. So that was a very retroactive choice to put that there. And that number doesn't appear until like the 400s and doesn't really get solidified until like the 200s BC, that I think the 753 BC number with Romulus and Remus actually gets like suggested and kind of pinned in place. So then the third layer is, like what I was just explaining, why the hell is the story like that if it is complete bullshit? So it's figuring out what parts of the story show up and when, why they might have been incorporated in the way that they are, why they fit a need or fit a preconception that the story audience might have heard, and then kind of recognizing, admitting defeat where we have to, that we cannot understand the original Rome that happened instead of Romulus and Remus and all this other stuff. We maybe have some archaeological data, the only truth, archaeological data that there was some early settlements around like 1000 BC, 1000 BC, which doesn't line up with Aeneas and doesn't line up with Romulus and Remus either, so...
Nope.
Great, but if we can't fully understand, at least not yet with the power of archaeology, we one day might, if we can't understand what really was the case, what can we learn about the people who told those stories? And that's kind of where the purpose of the video shifts halfway through, where I admit, yeah, we can't actually know this for a fact, but here's what we can learn about the Romans as they came to be. They were crafty bastards, and then use that to, again, create an identity and understand the character of the Romans through what they gave us in these stories, and that becomes a very interesting little bit of storytelling. And we can learn things like, for instance, the way that the Alban kings were constructed between Aeneas and Romulus was like, 11 or 12 or 13 kings that have, no basis in the historical narrative whatsoever. They were invented afterwards to, like you said, spackle over that period of time between Aeneas and Romulus to try to sort out that inconsistency of, we have two legendary founder kings, how are we going to deal with that? And the names of a lot of those Alban kings are partially based on geography, like, this is the Aventine Hill. One of those kings was named Aventinus, and the hill comes from the king. Definitely not the other way around. But also, a lot of the names come from people in the orbit of Augustus, because Augustus's people come into the picture when he is kind of consolidating this narrative in the 100s BC, and then a lot of them find their way into the narrative through the names of some of the Alban kings. So Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, a king is named kind of like after him. The Silvius king, King Iulus, King Attis, all these Augustan imperial families are basically retrojected into the story way back when to be like, yes, see, it was actually meant to be the whole time. This group of people were just ready, waiting to come and restore the Republic for how great Augustus is. And it's all obviously propaganda.
Yeah.
But we can understand that and learn about this moment in Augustan history through what appears in the story. But here's the thing. That last part wasn't in the video. None of the stuff with like Augustus and the Alban kings and the Roman ruling families in the 1st century BC show up in the video. Question is, why? In this instance, it's because I chose to tell a less complete story, but a more cohesive one, because I'm already dealing with a lot of time points here between 1200 BC, 753, 509 with the founding of the Republic, and as I was writing the script, adding these details about the Augustan era stuff seems like just one too many time points to keep track of, one too many things to deal with, a little too complicated to keep the narrative straight, so I thought, you know what? I'm gonna cut it. I'll just leave it out. I'll try to keep the story as focused on the narratives we have and the people telling them as I can, and kind of like gesture at Augustus vaguely, but not spend too much time talking about him, because it just is a little too much to keep track of. So for the sake of cohesion and consistency and presenting a clear story, I chose to kind of carve off a little bit of it and make it a little less complete. Was that the right choice? Maybe. I also completely didn't talk about the Etruscan kings because, again, I felt like it was a little too extraneous to the point that I was trying to make. So is that bias? Is that non-bias because I talked about one fewer thing? I don't know, but that is part of the process in telling these kinds of stories, and that was a choice that I had to make in this video. Even when I was like, let's go back and be more complete, I have to draw the line somewhere. I have to stop telling the story somewhere.
I think that's the interesting point to be aware of. Like, was it bias? I don't know, but it was a choice.
Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about this. I think everybody tells stories. I think, when even if you're just telling a funny thing that happened to you, it's a story that you're telling made out of things that you experienced. But you're still choosing how to tell it. You're still modifying things, you're furthering some goal. But most people aren't doing that consciously or intentionally. Most people aren't like, all right, I got to make sure that when I tell this story, everyone thinks I'm really funny and sexy. The thing is, sometimes you can tell that people are doing that, and it doesn't work because you can tell that they're doing that. But a lot of people will be like, oh, I'll leave that part out because it was boring, or like, oh, I'll ignore this bit because it was kind of a weird tangent, or I'll say that the thing I said was a little bit more polished and a little bit less stuttery than when I was coming up with it off the dome. And those are all choices that are being made, but they're usually just happening unconsciously because we're sort of feeling out what'll make the story better. And I think a large part of, storytelling is learning to be aware that you're doing that and to start doing it intentionally and only when you choose to.
Yeah.
Because, you know, like, it's impossible to tell a story without bias, but it is possible to, you know, make the choices deliberately when you are telling the story. And the more of that that you can do, usually the smoother the story's going to come out, because you'll have fewer blind spots in the way. You know, you'll be doing fewer things without thinking about them.
Oh, yeah.
And especially when it comes to historical narratives, like, I mean, you joke about, well, it wasn't even a joke when you were like, yeah, I mean, those texts are from the 1900s. They're practically worthless. And it's like, that was like 26 years ago at the end point of it. Like, that's not that long ago. But it doesn't take that long for you to notice, oh, wow, this writer just didn't even conceive of this as like a thing that was relevant. Like, you know, you go back to the 1800s and they're like, oh, none of these historians will ever talk about women as if they ever mattered. And it's not that they didn't, it's that the people writing couldn't conceive of that being important, or in some cases went out of their way to avoid it. Or like, oh yeah, these writers are talking about people who aren't white in a really gross way, but they're not doing it intentionally maliciously. They just think this is how everything works.
Just reinforced biases.
Yeah, they're casually disregarding anything that could prove them wrong because there's no space for it in the story they've already told themselves. And the more you become consciously aware of the stories that you're telling and are being told, the less prey you are to this sort of mindless shaping of your perspectives on things. And especially when it comes to history, I think that is so important to start being aware of in a very conscious way.
You touched on something that I can explain with a reference to Thucydides. I think the best way to combat these kinds of, like, you know, unconscious biases and like, oh, like, what's the author doing here, is just tip your hand. Just tell the audience what you're doing. It actually works remarkably well.
Oh, yeah.
Thucydides makes a point to say, like, hey, I know that even for speeches that I was in the audience for and I heard myself, my memory will be imperfect. So I made a point to go talk to people who were there, get their account of it, cross-reference it, and try to reconstruct to the best of my ability with what I have available to me what actually happened. In instances where I can't do that, or I wasn't there, I will make a point to try to create a version of the speech that would have been the best thing to say for the situation. So he's doing two completely separate things. One is painstaking source tracking back in the, 300s BC in Greece to try to get this as accurate as possible to what was actually spoken. And two is just a complete fabrication based on, uncharitably, the science of vibes, but based on Thucydides' understanding of, like, look, I know that I can't win the battle of dictating this properly because there are no people that I can track who have a record of this. So I'll do my best to just kind of make it up and make it fit with everything else that I have in my data points. And yeah, he's making it up, but I don't know if we could really call that, like, lying, because he's made it abundantly clear what he's doing.
Yeah.
And that's a case where respecting your audience and just tell them what you're doing makes it work really well.
Yeah, it's really funny. Every like 3 months, I remember that that's a thing I can do. Like, sometimes I'll be like working on a trope and I'll be kind of struggling because I'm like, oh, I don't know, I don't really like this one, but like, I want to be fair. And I'm like, I can be unfair. I can cover the ground I want to and also be like, I think this is dumb. Like, sometimes it's just very liberating to be like, here's what I honestly think about it, and I'm done like trying to sandpaper all my opinions off this thing and pretend like I'm a completely neutral entity with no opinions of my own.
Yep, exactly. So, Birth of Rome, I had to make a couple considerations for time, for pacing and stuff, but if we take a much bigger example, what happens when I don't have to cut any corners? What happens when I truly can spend as much time as I goddamn want to make it perfect?
Yep.
That's what happened when I was able to go back and do my history re-summarized of the Byzantine Empire, which at the time I gave this talk in Baltimore had come out yesterday, the day before.
Oh,
so
man.
I think a lot of people in the audience hadn't even seen it yet.
This talk came with homework and nobody knew.
Yeah, exactly, but they didn't know beforehand. Pop quiz. So with a cough 43-minute long video combining all three parts of my Byzantine series, the origins, the Golden Age, and the fall, I can do much more complex storytelling than I could with each original video, partially because I was willing to be like, I'm gonna add actually an entire fourth video's worth of bonus material into here to just add more details where I feel like they're relevant and interesting, but also the pacing of this being a much longer video allows me to do extended discussions on specific things where I can kind of take the time, slow down, zoom in, talk about, the military and social structure of how the Byzantine Empire worked, but also because I'm doing this combining 3 parts, and I can trust that if I'm here in part 3, someone has seen part 1 because they had to watch through it to get to this point in the video, I can do a lot more interesting setup payoff between the 3 different parts. So talking about military structure, I can mention the themata system in the part 2, the Golden Age, where the Byzantines basically restructured all their provincial armies to be very fast and nimble, and each governor of a province is in charge of his own tiny army, so they don't have to wait for Constantinople to send out some huge hulking force to the frontier. They've just got people right there they can work on. And then, in part 3, compare that to, we're losing provinces left and right. Day to day, a province can get cut in half by incoming Ottomans or whoever. We have to do this a little bit differently. So they change it to what's called the Pronia system. I'm not going to get into the details, but I can do a setup payoff where I can talk about it here, talk about it again there, and we can compare them together, knowing that we've had both of those things set up. I can also do a similar thing when talking about the enemies of the Byzantines, starting in, the 300s BC with the Goths at the very beginning of the video, talking about their Persian rivals, their Arabic rivals, and finally with the Ottomans. And I can do a little bit of a fun compare and contrast there, where the Ottomans and the Goths kind of look similar and are operating in similar ways to each other, even though they're separated by 1400 years or so. I can do a very interesting little bit of payoff based on what I set up in part 1. So being able to tell a much broader and deeper story, reaching across these individual parts, pulling a thread here, plugging it back in over there, is so much fun and so interesting, and it creates a much deeper story than just putting them back to back to back in a row, hoping people watch them through the playlist or watch one video and then, remember most of it when they watch the second one. If it's all together, it can be a much more compelling and well-constructed story, and I give myself the ability to just take all the time I want. It's like, I'm gonna bust my butt for this. I'm gonna work 10-hour days for 3 weeks straight. I can do it once, and then I'll crash on the couch for a month, but I can do it once. And this is like, okay, I'm cashing in that effort. You can only give 110% on a few rare occasions. This is one of those times where I will in fact do that, and then I'll be on 50% for the rest of the year to recover from it.
Yeah, no, it is always kind of fun just to be like, what if I could just give this infinite effort? And it's interesting because you've got a lot more control over that than I do. For me, it's either this is the most boring thing I've ever had to drudge through and I just need to finish it, or it's what do you mean it's been 12 hours? I'm not done yet. And I have no control over when those things happen. But it was kind of interesting seeing you shift into my version of the zone for this video and then be like, okay, I can only do it once. I'm donezo, baby.
But then it's also this can be viewed as one part of a larger whole. And I cannot do any of these things at once. I can kind of build up this body of work over time, and then I have a bunch of different things to plug together. So what if an even larger video were to exist where I took my entire narrative of Roman history and put it into one gigantic unit? What kind of storytelling can I do then? You can do complete history of Rome is what you can do then. And this is, to date, the best thing I've ever created, because the way the narratives talk to each other can fundamentally transform, and everything gets a new meaning in this macro context where I am setting up things in the birth of Rome that get paid off in the Byzantine Empire resummarized. I'm setting things up in Birth of Rome that pay off in Augustus's, City of Marble era and the Augustan program, and building a sense of lineage and connection of him to Aeneas and making those things fit. And I can do that kind of storytelling over this huge arc in a way that I couldn't before when the pieces were just kind of floating there in space. So it is not just that it's a big video. The storytelling deepens when I'm able to bring everything together and have all these parts talk to each other. And again, I can only do it once, but I could do it. That's the important thing here.
No, that's one of the coolest things about history, is that the more of it you understand and the more context you have, you'll be aware of okay, there's still more ground to cover. But the more context you have, it almost starts space filling in a very fractal way. The sum of its parts is less than the whole that you get by understanding the sum of its parts, because you start interpolating, you start seeing patterns and echoes and poetry in things that were previously just things happening. Storytelling is an interesting overlay onto the events of history, because again, history is not itself a story, but stories arise from it. And the more of it you understand, the more kinds of stories you start to see, the more threads you begin to see connecting things that realistically were not actually connected. disconnected, separated by like centuries or even millennia, but you see them from the top down and you're like, I can draw something here. I can draw a connection from point A to point B and make that into a story where there was no story before. And the more of it you understand and the more of it you lay out and the more of the context you all put in one place, the better chance there is of your audience actually understanding, what you're cooking.
Yeah.
Good job.
It's fun. Thank you. I tuned in like 3 years for a complete history of Greece. Who knows? And even still, like this narrative is not complete. There are a bunch of history makers that are relevant to this story that just aren't part of this because they're their own separate videos. So it gets fractal. I can spend even more time talking about it, 3 hours, and yet, I have to stop telling the story somewhere. Even with this, I have to stop telling the story somewhere.
Yeah, after a certain point, we're wearing down a mountain with the eagle's beak. You gotta start doing something else with your days after a while.
So as much of a Giga Chad master of history as I am with complete history of Rome, better historians do exist. I am second only to Mary Beard, but oh boy, I'm coming for the throne. So while I'm down here in second place, he said, obviously sarcastically,
yes.
Why listen to me? I am a, trained historian, but there are people who are a lot better at this than I am. What I think I am able to offer is an ability to tell interesting and insightful stories in a different way, using the benefits of this YouTube medium that fills a niche that is not otherwise filled. It is not necessarily a question of just better or worse. People are obviously very talented at the height of the field, publishing all the big books here. There are people who are really good at this and have, that top billing, but there are different fields and niches and interests and audiences that can benefit from different types of storytelling. So what is it that I'm doing in this very crowded field of very talented historians? Bearing in mind that it's even worse because I'm a cartoon character, so I'm really coming from a disadvantage here in terms of credibility and trust.
They got a whole extra dimension on me, boss. What am I gonna do?
I know. What keeps me making videos? I think it's really 4 things. I tell stories, not just information. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. My work is accessible. YouTube is free. I tried to make it very, very welcoming. There's no judging. There's no homework. There is no test, as much as we sometimes joke about, like, oh, this will be on the test. No, it won't. There is no test. Did you have fun? You passed. Did you learn something? You passed. Great. That's it. Easy, accessible, perfectly fine. No pressure, no pain, nothing. Unless you find my jokes grating, in which case, fair. I make a point to prioritize credibility and authenticity. So going back to what we were talking about in Thucydides, he shows his hand when he tells his history. I try to do a very similar thing of like, here's where I'm coming from. I am a classicist. I look at all of this stuff through the lens of civilizations and societies as a whole. I'm not focused on military history. I'm not focused on, kings and rulers and junk. I like literature. I like art. I really like architecture. Those are my lens. Those are my biases, if we want to call them that, which they kind of are.
Yeah.
And in being very forward about that and where I'm coming from, what my background is, what I'm doing in my videos, what my goals are, some of it I state kind of outright, some of it you can kind of pick up casually and subconsciously just by watching a lot of my work. You get a sense of what I'm going for, and that helps the viewer put my videos in the right part of their brain and understanding what is going on, what is the goal of this. Okay, cool. I, as the viewer, can interpret this, correctly and try to get the right effect out of this. And then fourth, of course, is funny, haha, man likes domes. Comedy. It's a very important part of what we're doing here.
Yep. But at the same time, that I'd fold into the whole acknowledging your bias thing. Like, hello, I think that there is one architectural feature that is superior to all others, and I will lose my mind whenever I see one. That's a bias, but it's also funny.
Oh, yeah.
And it's funnier when you know that it's happening. It would be weird if you were trying to convince everyone else that domes are the objectively perfect architectural form, and there's no bias in this whatever. It's just that everyone who thinks otherwise is stupid, and it only works when you do that because we know that you're f***ing with them.
Yeah. And again, that's me showing my hand, and that's why it works. Exactly, Red, exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, videos, I mentioned this in the accessibility section, videos are a very handy medium for education. They are more personal. They don't require intense concentration. It's a lot easier to a casual viewer or maybe an overworked college student than trying to read through a book. It runs at a smooth pace. You don't have to be, laser focused in on the text. If you kind of like relax for a second and aren't hyper focused, the video will still progress. You won't get lost. It'll kind of pull you along. The video experience doesn't require a white knuckle grip like sometimes reading can feel like it does. And reading is great.
Especially reading history texts.
Yeah, it's a very effort-intensive process. You can be pulled through a video in a way that reading doesn't necessarily lend itself to. Information can also be packed far more densely if I'm able to show visuals as well as what I'm saying. There can be a lot of stuff going on at once, which sometimes can feel overwhelming, but that's the benefit of being able to easily go back and rewatch it. You can pause, you can put it at your own speed. If you want to go double speed like a monster, I approve, I support you. It is the correct way. You mentioned this on Tumblr. This is the correct way to watch your videos is double speed.
Well, because I was always getting ragged on for talking fast, and then someone's like, sometimes when I don't have time, I watch your videos double speed, and I was like, you're the only one who understands. You're the only person who understands my vision. You gotta go fast.
And being able to put an inflection in voices is a huge benefit. If it's just a monotone, it can be very easy to get lost, but you can convey a lot through acting and presentation and emphasis. And also, I like that I can use maps.
Yep.
I find maps a nice way to kind of show civilizations at a glance. I can show states as characters. I've got my little Rome icon, and I can put words in its mouth. I can have it say, funny things or reveal its character through what it does and how it interacts with other little icons and other civilizations. There's a kind of like chess-like understandability from this top-down view that I quite enjoy, which is why even if I could draw and illustrate, all of these as individual scenes, that's not the type and pace of storytelling that I prefer.
Yeah.
It's a completely different and equally valid style. Extra History does a great job of that. They illustrate it. All their videos are beautiful, but it's a very different kind of storytelling with different pacing considerations entirely from what I'm doing.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of mirrors that thing you were talking about before about being able to sort of zoom in gradually, from the largest scale to the smallest without going, without jump cutting from one to the other and losing everybody. Because it's like, okay, here is the world map. Here's the region map. Here's paintings of the things I'm talking about happening. Like, it's the slow zoom in, it's the wide shot, medium shot, close up versus like, establishing to super close up kind of thing. And and it works very well with maps as the primary visual indicator of literally where we are.
Yeah. It's a very grounding presence, I think, for the videos. But also, like you said, Red, being funny helps. Comedy lowers the temperature of a learning environment substantially and lets the viewers feel more at ease. If I'm not taking this completely seriously and I'm having fun, you are also allowed to have fun. I'm not grading you or judging you. I'm having fun. You can have fun. Again, it's signposting. I'm showing my hand here. This makes our videos more accessible and welcoming, and also hopefully more interesting to engage with. There are a lot of ways to make videos engaging. This is just the one that I enjoy.
Yeah.
And the important thing, regardless of what kind of tone I'm trying to strike with my videos, whether it's fireside, let me tell you a little story of domes or whatever, or over-the-top jokes, is the ability to be compelling, to craft a narrative that is interesting and engaging and can grab people and make them want to learn more. That is the goal. There's many ways to get to that goal. This is the one that I choose, but it is one of many, and there are a lot of different people who tell stories in different ways. So I like to think that OSP can be your entry point into world culture. You can start with us, and we can show you how cool the world is in history and literature and myths, and you then will have the tools to go out, do your own research, read books for yourself, and learn and have fun. So you watch a deep dive into Artemis and Apollo, and then you can go read Homer. You watch a history summarized on Florence, and you can go read Machiavelli. You watch a trope talk on ancient superweapons, and you go watch Nausicaa.
Yeah.
Watch a history makers on Plato, and then go read the dialogues. We want to be your springboard to go out and learn and have fun with all of these things. So we are essentially excavating this first layer for you, and then you can begin digging from there.
Yeah.
So to bring it to a conclusion, better historians exist. My job is to prepare you for them.
Yeah.
And that is essentially the whole thesis, my whole MO of how I make videos.
Oh, that's clean. I like that. Because, like the thing that we've been trying to highlight since day one is like, we're not where you should stop researching. Don't cite my videos especially. Blue has the benefit of like, this is a book. Here's the book that I summarized this from. Here's other required reading. Whereas for me, it's like, look, Homer said this. Hesiod said this. A lot of the rest of it is my funny ha-has. We should never be where you stop researching, but the whole point of the way that we frame, history and literature and mythology is to highlight like, look, this stuff is on its own interesting. Like, we don't need to make it interesting. That thing I was saying about how like Wikipedia is the map that you look at before you dive deeper, we're also the map. Like
We're also a map.
yeah, like Wikipedia, like again, like I said, like, oh, I made my living doing summaries, but I don't think that you should stop with the summary. Yeah, I make a summary and then I'm like, great, now that you understand the cool shit, you can see your way through the boring. I'm very upfront about this. All my early summaries were ways for me to get my ADHD ass through like having to required reading all of Shakespeare and all of Homer. Like, those are not built for you to just kind of be able to sit down and get through in one sitting. They're not friendly for that. And Shakespeare is not designed for that. Shakespeare you should be watching on a stage. Reading the script already is doing it a disservice. But like, if you have to get through it, it's much easier to get through it if someone has already gone through and highlighted, hey, this part's really funny actually. Or like, here's what this guy is saying and it's one giant joke. Or like, here's the f***ing boat list. I can't excuse the boat list, but on the other side of the boat list, there's more cool shit.
And then it becomes an inside joke where people are like, oh, hell yeah, boat list.
Boat list. Yeah, no, it's just, there's so much interesting stuff out there, but a lot of it is hard to find. And that's why having a map is very helpful. But the map doesn't get you everything you would get by digging it up yourself. That's the whole point of the process of research. And like we said, you know, parts of it can be a slog, but it's the pulling out of information. It's the being surprised by things that you didn't even know you were looking for. That's a huge part of what makes it so rewarding. It's funny, the culmination of our work is like the start of everybody else's. It's like, okay, that was fun. You've got this in your head. You've got the jokes, you've got the layout, you've got the general map. Okay, now what do you want to research? Which is why, like, one of my favorite bits of feedback we ever get is people being like, hey, this made me interested in pursuing this, or like, now I'm majoring in this thing because I want to know more. And it's like, yes, that's all I wanted to do. I had to get into this stuff from nothing, not even the trust me, bro, it gets better. Just like, what do you mean you don't find this fascinating and engaging? It's an enduring text that has lasted for 3,000 years. It's like, yeah, fucking feels like it, Chief. But just like going through it, and it's like, okay, if I was gonna tell somebody else how this story went, what would I need to use as signposts? And then, okay, great. Now that that's sorted out, someone who's going in isn't gonna go in blind and have to pick their way. We shouldn't be where you end. Definitely not. We're just a couple of goofballs having a good time, you know, having fun, unpacking information, and then not putting 100% of the information we have into our videos. We're not even a good source for completely summarizing the texts we read. We leave out for pacing, as we just established.
Always off cuts.
Yeah, but if we're a solid jumping off point, that's all we wanted to be, man. So like,
that's the mission accomplished.
Hell yeah. It did kind of feel like we were given our resume this whole time. It's like, why should you consider me above other historians? Well, you see, I am funny. And
it is kind of like, you know, me giving a little bit of my resume, because so much of what I'm doing in my videos is trying to surface a little bit per episode of my process, of how I think about this, of what I try to prioritize. And some videos have that more than others. Some videos have a little bit of a history maker's twinge to them. Like my Pope fights on the pornocracy is very much one historian yelling at another historian about how they're bad at their job. And then you can learn from that what the historian yelling values in a history book. In my case of like, hey, don't lie about what people were like. Maybe, please, could you? And I get to put a little bit of that in every video, but again, there's a pacing consideration. I cannot open every video with a manifesto on how I do my work.
Yeah.
So this kind of exists to be like, let me just put it all in one place. Obviously, there are going to be little bits and bobs and different observations and things that creep into my videos still going forward and until the end of time. But I wanted to be able to surface this in a way that was easily accessible and referenceable on the channel as my methods, to a lesser extent, Red's methods on how this works, because I liked giving this talk a lot. I had a really fun time. The audience was amazing. They were so engaged and enthusiastic. And when I realized, like, oh, I'm actually not in a position to really give this talk in any other places, I don't want to let the talk die.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be able to put this on the channel so that it exists as a record and as a manual of how we do our work. And me showing my hand, this whole video was me showing my hands to you on how I do what I do.
Yep.
So if you got that sense from me, I have succeeded in this video today.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting space to cover, just to unpack, like, what do we do? Why do we do it? How do we do it? And what's the point of doing it? One of the interesting things about our perspective on like, yeah, we're keeping this entry level is there's still a degree to which it's not entry level. It's presuming a certain amount of like a roughly comparable level of education on like world history, world mythology. Like, oh, everybody knows Greek and Norse mythology, obviously, and probably also Egyptian, et cetera, et cetera.
And quartz, of course.
Yeah, and quartz, of course. I've had conversations with people where they're like, what's a pantheon? And I'm like, I need to roll this back.
We can assume a kind of self-selecting of people who are at least interested on the topic enough to click on it.
Yeah.
And then we can start to learn from them. So we can't assume, perfect knowledge. We can't assume zero knowledge. We can assume you are at least curious.
Yeah.
You showed up. And this is something that I struggle with a lot, is conveying the right information at the very beginning of my videos to give the viewer everything they need to follow along as if this is the first, blue video of OSP they've ever seen, while also not making it interminably boring for everybody else who has seen all of our other videos.
Yeah.
And that balance is very hard to strike, which is why I try to, when I'm writing it here, I'm showing my hand, when I'm writing my intros, the first paragraph or two are usually pretty dang dense, and there's a lot of stuff packed in there because I'm essentially throwing out a lot of different little terminologies and things to try to set the scene. And if I'm throwing out 8 or 9 or 10 hooks, my hope is that 2 of them latch. If you have an anchor point on 2 of the things that I'm mentioning in my first paragraph, great. We're good. That's enough. You can follow along and basically be completely solid. And if you already know those things, they pass by quickly enough, and I can hopefully tell them in a funny way that they don't feel like they kill the pacing. So again, Red, to your point, these are the kinds of problems we have to deal with every single script that we write.
Yeah. It's funny. I do kind of write my trope talks on the assumption that people have probably watched one before, and I'll use the intro as an excuse for me to sort of just ramble about a vague thing that is connected to what I want to talk about, but it's the sort of largest scope, where are we starting from? And it's usually something larger and vaguer, and then I scope down into and today we're talking about this specific element or this weird twist on this or something like that. It's a weird balance to strike, and the problem is you sort of just have to pick which audience you are selecting for. Are you constantly trying to onboard new people, or are you trying to continue what is essentially a loose, slow conversation with people who've been engaging with it for a while?
And I think we tends to come down on the it's a loose, slow conversation. We make it accessible, we make it welcoming, but it's very much like a lot of our videos are in conversation with other ones. It's part of a broader space of storytelling rather than individual little bite-sized things. But yeah, that's why our job is so fun. There are a lot of challenges. It gets to work our brain.
Yeah.
That's why we love doing what we do. And
we're
gonna have a lot of fun making plenty more videos in the future. But until such a time as our next video comes out.
So,
bye.
Perfect.